let me introduce you the next speaker. So Thomas, who is now the holder of an interim chair for German literature and media science at the University of Saarland in Saarbrücken. And his talk is entitled How Early 20th Century Art and Literature Reach to Theories About Empathy.
So let me maybe start out by saying some words about the kind of talk you're going to hear. It's not the kind of talk with philosophical ambition like Christiana's talk we just heard right now. I'm not going to defend special claim and present arguments in favor of the claim. And I'm afraid I will also fail in delivering something as inspiring and lyrical as Siri did. I will just tell you some stories I consider interesting. So yeah, maybe you can just relax and let Uncle Tom tell you some stories about how it was back then in the 1890s and early 1900s. Germany, in Munich especially, as you will see. So let me start out by some preliminaries. So what do I mean when I talk about theories of empathy? Well, that's easy. I mean literally everything this cast of guys there said. As you all know, the so-called Einfühlungsästhetics or aesthetics of empathy was the predominant aesthetic theory around 1900 in the German-speaking countries. And all these theoreticians here, they were the main protagonists. And my idea is just what they thought about empathy, whatever that may be. I want to just have a look at that and what artists made of these theories. So there will not be a deep dive into details of these theories, but just a look at the reactions to whatever these guys here said. The core idea of the Einfühlungsästhetik, you all know, is that aesthetic artifacts do not in fact have properties, aesthetic properties and affective properties, like being sad, enthralling, uplifting, and so on. We just empathically project such contents into the objects. Yeah. So aesthetic experiences of kind of self-experience. This is what Lipps, for example, claimed famously. Yeah, and therefore aesthetics is of course considered a part of psychology. If it's about what happens in my mind, in my psyche, then it's for psychology to analyze what's going on there. Preliminaries too. Why is it a good idea to look at connections between theory and practice in this case? Well, that's also easy because there are a lot of connections that make it prima facie interesting to look at the kind of connections we are confronted with here. So poets, authors of novels, painters, architects, movie directors, they all read about the aesthetics of empathy, and they all try to somehow work with it in their art. Just some examples. There are much more, and if you're interested, I can bore you in the discussion really with lots of details and anecdotes about all these connections. So, for example, the poet Rainer Maria Rilke studies under Lipps in Munich, actually. The architect August Indell, who did the Hackische Höfe in Berlin, that maybe some of you know, actually started working on his PhD under Lipps's supervision, also in Munich. Violet Paget, better known under her alias Vernon Lee, also fought through the difficult, prolix, and hard to understand, even for native speakers, I would say, German publications. David Roman and we met in Cambridge at a conference that was entirely dedicated to Vernon Lee's connections to the aesthetics of empathy. So there's a lot of stuff worth considering here. And also Wassily Kandinsky also lived in Munich in the 1890s and 1910s. And he also discussed empathy, aesthetics, and all the good stuff with his painter colleagues, Alexander von Jablensky and Marianne Werefkin, who also was a big fan of Lipps and also went to the university to hear him in his lectures. Franz Marc, another world-famous painter, was also into the aesthetics of empathy. He actually lived in the same house with Theodor Lipps for 2 years in Schwabing, a small part of Munich. Yeah, just another funny coincidence. And the world-renowned movie director Sergey Eisenstein also read Lipps and did discuss the Einfühlungsästhetik in his theoretical work on theater and film, and tried to transfer Lippsian ideas on empathy into practice in his groundbreaking movies. I could go on, but I think you get the gist. There is a lot of interesting connections there. So what am I going to talk about then? Well, I will not extensively talk about the theories of empathy themselves. I already said that. You guys are experts anyway. We have heard talks about that before by Michele yesterday. David pointed out some interesting points in his short introduction. And I have wasted precious time on preliminaries already. So let me get to the point. I will present you two examples. I already mentioned Rilke is the first one. It's about the aesthetics of language, this symposium. So I figured Rilke would be a good idea. I want to know what were his connections to aesthetic theory in his personal life, as well as in his intellectual life, if you will. And how did he react to these theories? In which sense did his knowledge of the theories influence his poetry? And my second example is Sergey Eisenstein, and I will just ask the same questions here. What did he know? What did he read? And in what kind of way did he try to incorporate his knowledge into his movies? Okay, so let me start out with Rilke. Rilke moves from Prague to Munich in 1896, and he takes up studies of literature, philosophy, and art history there. He had already started these studies back in Prague, but he's happy to move to Munich, which he considers an open, big city, and he's eager to get to know the big city life. And interestingly enough, his Testierbuch, his transcript of records, as you would call it in today's terminology maybe, is archived. And during his first semester, one can read up that he attended the lecture Fundamentals of Aesthetics by Professor Theodor Lipps. Rilke never was particularly ambitious as a student. There are lots of funny stories around that. He liked the air of being a scholar, is what he once noted. But even if he didn't pay attention during the lecture by Lipps, there was no escaping the aesthetics of empathy in Munich during the late 1890s. For example, during his summer holidays in 1897, Lipps went to Wolfratshausen, a small town in the vicinity of Munich, with Lou Andreas Salome, who all of you also know, and August Endel, the architect. I already mentioned him as well. And you see the guy in green, the green arrow points to, that's Rilke, and this guy is August Endel. So they spent almost half a year there, the entire summer. And of course, they talked about aesthetics, theories of aesthetics, and they'll try to educate Rilke on Velázquez and whatever the details. But yeah, even if in his private life, Rilke was confronted with the aesthetic theories on empathy of the time. Lou also sent books to Rilke several times. For example, Wilhelm Worringer's Abstraction and Empathy, which Rilke actually reads with the greatest approval, as he puts it. And as I just said, Rilke was never such an avid reader as, for example, Sergey Eisenstein. So it's interesting to know that Lou oftentimes sent books to Rilke, and Rilke just said, yeah, thanks a lot, and then he sent them back. But in this case, and in the case of Henri Bergson, he insisted that he wanted to keep the books. So he actually seems to have read through them, worked through them, and he actually seems to have been interested in empathy and theories of empathy. Okay, so I think it's fair to say Rilke knew what the theories of the time were. He was immersed in them. He tried to read up on them as much as he could. And then, and this was my claim, he actually put them into aesthetic practice in his poetry. I will have a look at that in a second. So there are also lots of traces in his of his intellectual struggles in his theoretical writings, of which there are not many, in some letters or reviews. I will just skip through that and then concentrate on his poetry. He says things like, art is the dark desire of things. They force themselves into our trembling senses and thirst to become excuses for our feelings. So this seems to echo this idea of the aesthetics of empathy. Our feelings are projected into the things. Things are just excuses for our feelings. And even the research literature on Rilke claims that Rilke recalled the teachings of his old professor in Munich, Theodor Lipps, and devised a process of conscious observation, which it would come to call Einsehen or inseeing. So the claim here seems to be Einsehen, this is what Rilke does, is similar to Einfühlen, what he learned back in Munich. I think it's a little simplistic to put it that way, but Rilke actually talks about this Einsehen in a letter to a friend, for example. This is where he writes, I love the inseeing, this Einsehen. Can you understand how wonderful it is, for example, to see a dog, see oneself into it while passing it by? I do not mean seeing through the dog, which is just some kind of human gymnastics, and where one also immediately slips out of the dog on the other side, looking at it, as it were, only as a window into the human lying behind that, not that. So I would say his idea of Einsehen seems to contradict the idea of Einfühlen in a way. Einfühlen is more this thing here, seeing the object only as a window into the human lying behind it, because it's our affective states that are projected into the object of contemplation during Einfühlung. And this is what Rilke does not want to have here. And his idea is to write poems that capture the essence of a thing poetry, Dinggedichte, it's called in German, without contaminating it, so to speak, by empathizing one's own emotion into it, in the style of Lipps. So how does Rilke do that? Just one example. His very well-known poem, Blue Hydrangea, is, I think, an example of his struggles with Einfühlung and overcoming maybe this Einfühlung idea that he was confronted with in Munich. And I will tell you why I think it is this way. So first of all, what's obvious here is that Rilke uses a lot of affect-centric language. The poem is about stains of tears, as affecting as a life soon over. So the whole area of emotions, affects, shines through in the poem. And the poem uses lots of comparisons, metaphors, and not objective descriptions. Yeah, this was his idea. He wants to capture the essence of a thing and not contaminate it with what the observer thinks about the thing. And this is, of course, problematic if you use a lot of comparisons, because it seems to the observer that the leaves look like vestiges or like a child's pinafore. Even more interesting is then the way to kind of capture these emotional contents in the poem without actually portraying them as empathically projected into the poem. And his idea seems to be that he wants the reader to feel the affective contents as a property of the hydrangea itself. And how does he do that? Well, for example, here in the last sentence, I think he tries to do that. And he makes the blue, the color of the flower, the subject of his sentence. And it's actually the blue that gladdens beside the green. It's not an observer that is rejoicing, that is happy about the blue. The blue actually gladdens, rejoices itself. So there is no observer needed. It's just a description of what's actually there. So this seems to be maybe an idea that Rilke has to overcome this idea. All the affective contents are projected into the object by the observer. Rilke's struggles are ongoing with this in his Thing poetry, and I think philology has actually addressed this struggle, maybe without knowing its roots in Rilke's time in Munich and his studies under Lipps. Leopold Liegler, a well-known German Rilke scholar, claimed as early as 1947, the poet, this is Rilke in this case, in fact does not just confront the object in an objective way, like he wants to do, we know, but rather he empathizes with the object and becomes its speaker and the portrayer of its essence. So, yeah, and in which sense he empathizes and in which sense he doesn't try to not empathize, this is what yeah, we just learned. His later poems, I would claim, clearly display his ongoing interest in this problem. I cannot delve into that here. You just have to believe me. This is an ongoing struggle. As late as 1914, Rilke is still thinking about these things. Okay, so instead of following Rilke into his later poetry, let's have a look at another artist. And this other artist is the before mentioned Sergey Eisenstein. Yeah, you all know the guy. He's famous not only for his haircut, but for making some of the most well-known movies of all time. I think in the Rolling Stone or another top-notch scientific journal, there has been a ranking of the most influential movies of all time, and Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin actually topped the list. So he is the director of the most influential movie ever. And not only that, he actually was an avid reader. He read through literally everything he could get his hands on. And he, among other things, he also read Lipps, who was translated into Russian at the time. And interesting for us, he actually quotes Lipps in his own theoretical work on film and on theater. Eisenstein started out as a director at a theater in Moscow and later went into movies. According to Eisenstein, this is what he writes in his theoretical texts, Lipps has proven, and this is the word Eisenstein uses, how empathy comes about, more precisely why and when we tend to empathically mirror another's affective states. And this is the paper that Eisenstein quotes, Das Wissen von fremden Ichen, which I have translated into the knowledge of other selves. I don't know if that's perfectly accurate, but I think it serves the purpose here. There, Lipps explains that it is the perception of bodily gestures which tends to lead to my tendency to mimic the affective dimension of this experience. And this is what interests Eisenstein. This is what he takes from Lipps. And of course, all of you may have noticed that this is something that very much resembles what was at the time discussed under the label James Lange hypothesis. Because William James and Karl Lange, a Danish philosopher and psychologist, simultaneously came up with the same idea that is best, I think, phrased by William James, and most famously as well. You all probably know this quote. James says, common sense says, we lose our fortune, are sorry and weep. We meet a bear, are frightened and run. We are insulted by a rival, are angry and strike. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect, that one mental state is not immediately induced by the other, that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful, as the case may be. This is the hypothesis that Lipps is actually critical about in his later work, but that's not interesting for Eisenstein. Eisenstein just gets this idea from the literature. And yeah, to reiterate, Eisenstein is no scientist or scholar. He doesn't care about quoting sources. He actually mixes up theories. And this goes into this direction. And their defendants and concocts, as I would put it, his own eclectic brand of theory, which is only interesting for him insofar as he can model his movies or plays according to it. So this is what is interesting for him, and let's have a look at that. What does he actually make of this theories? Well, his core idea is that movies and plays are supposed to move or even manipulate the audience by what he calls a montage of attraction. So it's not actually about telling a story. Eisenstein explicitly claims this is not what movies are about. Movies are about moving the audience in a way, yeah, manipulating their affects. And if you can do that by telling a story, but you don't have to. Yeah, his early plays are very avant-garde. All kinds of crazy things happen on stage. Yeah, priests somersaulting across the stage while there were actually fireworks went off in the theater itself. So all kinds of crazy things. But that's fine for Eisenstein because these are attractions and they are meant to move the audience. And this is what art and especially movies and theater are about. Well, and this is something where the James Lange hypothesis, he thinks, can help him. Yeah, he tries to instigate revolutionary anger in the audience of his movies, especially of his early movies, his first movie Strike and his second movie Battleship Potemkin. And this is the example we want to have a look at. How does this work actually? Yeah. Just to remind you of the context of this short clip, I will show you in a second. After refusing to eat maggot-infested food, several members of the Potemkin's crew are found guilty of insubordination and are sentenced to death by firing squad. However, the firing squad refuses to obey the orders, and the crew rebels against the officers. They are successful in their rebellion and take command of the ship, but their leader, the leader of the rebellion, the sailor Vakulinchuk, is killed in the proceedings. His body is then taken ashore and displayed at the port of Odessa, and there the people's grief soon turns into revolutionary fury against the oppressors. And there is this down with the executioners, it says, and then there is this world-famous scene where the grief turns into revolutionary anger. And this is a scene that I wanted to show you. So as I just said, these are mourning just random people at the shore, and let's have a look what happens here. Down with tyranny, that's what it says. Okay, so what did we just see there? What happened there? Well, Eisenstein cuts 6, and immediately after the clip we just saw, there are 2 more. Eisenstein cuts 6 close-ups of clenching fists into the scene. I think you might have realized them. I have just cropped them out here. This is what it looks like, and this is what the James Lange hypothesis has taught him. This is his idea. His idea is to entice bodily mimicry in the audience, which then, according to what he read in Lipps, or what the James Lange hypothesis says, should lead the audience to experience even more anger, fury, wrath against the bourgeois oppressors. This is his idea, and this is what he actually does. Yeah, we tend to mimic the gestures, the clenching fists. To clench a fist leads to fury, anger. This is the classic gesture of wrath, of being angry at something, and therefore he thinks the audience should really be in the revolutionary mood that he wants them to be in. And later he actually hinted at that himself. This is what he wrote about his movie of Potemkin. He says, I can say without false modesty that many millions of people have seen it. Some probably choked on their tears at the scene of Mourning for the Dead, Bakulinchuk. But surely not a single one of those millions even noticed the tiny montage strip consisting of a few shots in this scene. A tiny frame that is probably not even really perceived, and if so, merely as a purely dynamic accent, a small ornament in the scene, so that one can hardly perceive what is actually going on. Yeah, and we know now what is actually going on. He cut this clenched fists into the scene with a clear purpose, with clear intentions of instigating revolutionary anger. Yeah, and if we have learned nothing else, our brief look at the historic theories of aesthetic empathy and their adaptations by artists has taught us what was actually going on. We have seen through Eisenstein's ruse, and that's something I would claim. So thanks for listening.